Well, it does trouble a lot of people. Some just can't figure it out, but they believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and they trust that eventually they will. Others are troubled and they decide, well, that's an error. I'm convinced that Scripture does say that it's fully divinely inspired. 2 Timothy 3:16, for example. So I think that when we find these passages, we need to act like Sherlock Holmes and realize there's a solution to it. And I find that about, I would say, 9 times out of 10, when you go back to the Old Testament context and you look at it very, very carefully in its immediate context and its broad context, that usually what you find in the Old Testament does align in a significant way with what's going on in the New Testament. Realizing, of course, when the New Testament quotes the Old, it's not always carrying over the full context, but a significant strand from that context. So we wouldn't expect a photographic image in the New Testament from the Old Testament, because also the New Testament's interpreting the Old Testament. And in the light of fuller progressive revelation, you're going to get new details that fill out the interpretation of that Old Testament text. We call that actually biblical theology or progressive revelation, the organic development of revelation, so that later texts interpret earlier texts. So I find actually, you know, what Augustine said is so helpful, that the New Testament reveals the Old Testament, but the New lies hidden in the Old. So that both Testaments actually interpret one another, and we need to equally let them do that. So there are some passages, of course, that may be difficult to interpret. We may not be completely confident of the solution that we come to, but you know, that's true of other parts of Scripture. Those of us who believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, there are certain parts of Scripture that are very difficult, and so we don't pronounce a verdict, you know, you're guilty of error, but you know, we leave it alone and keep working on it. In fact, I have found, as some of my students have gone on to doctoral work, that they've taken some of these difficult passages that they've been troubled with, and they haven't declared it an error, but they've said, we're going to work on it a little more. And they do a dissertation on it. In fact, they find the solution in the dissertation. So because of a high view of inerrancy, biblical scholarship is proceeding, especially with evangelicals at some of these university institutions, because these are passages that the liberals won't work on because of, oh, there are errors. That's the liberal orthodoxy. But evangelicals, they're not willing to press a harmonization that's superficial, but they want to keep working on it. And as they do, they often find the solution to it. I could give you plenty of solutions to that, but one is Ricky Watts and his work on the on Mark as a second Isaianic Exodus, and in the opening quotation there that's attributed to Isaiah, but first quotes Malachi. It looks like Mark didn't know his Old Testament. But in fact, Ricky Watts and I were sitting in a Cambridge seminar where a professor was talking about the use of the Old Testament of Mark and said, well, first shot out of the bag, Mark wrongly attributes this passage, these quotations to Isaiah, when really it begins with Malachi. He just didn't know his Old Testament enough. Long and short of it is that Ricky Watts did his dissertation on that passage and others from Isaiah, and showed that it fit in perfectly, and showed how Malachi really was in lockstep with Isaiah. So a lot of exciting work is done by people in our doctoral institutions because they believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. It keeps them exploring.